It was just a stuck zipper. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But the moment my stepson stepped into the room, everything changed, his touch, his gaze. It awakened something in me I wasn't ready to face. I had always thought of myself as a woman in control, poised, balanced, and deeply committed to my family. My husband James and I had built a life together that seemed picturesque on the surface. A lovely home, thriving careers, and a bond that felt unshakable. Yet, over time, the cracks began to form. James, once attentive and caring, had grown distant, consumed by work and indifferent to the person I still was underneath the weight of our daily routines. Caleb, my stepson, was a presence that brought light into the house. He had always been polite, respectful, and reserved, traits that made him easy to be around. When he came home for the summer from college, it was supposed to be a routine visit, a chance to reconnect as a family. But with James working long hours and absent most evenings, the house felt quieter than ever. Caleb's presence filled that void in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had fallen into my own rhythm of loneliness, a quiet resignation to the life I thought I was supposed to live. My days blurred into one another, and I clung to small routines like sorting through old clothes, cooking dinner, or reading in the evenings to give myself a sense of purpose. It was during one of these mundane afternoons that I stumbled upon the black dress. The dress had been an emblem of another version of myself, a version that felt alive, confident, and worthy of attention. It hung in the back of the closet, forgotten, until I pulled it out. Its silky fabric seemed to whisper of a time when I wasn't invisible, when I still believed in the power of my own presence. Slipping into it stirred something within me, a desire to reclaim that person I once was, even for just a moment. Yet, as I stood struggling with the zipper, frustration mounting, I realized I couldn't manage it alone. The realization struck me with a mix of embarrassment and necessity. Caleb was upstairs, and I called out for his help. It was supposed to be a simple moment, innocent and unremarkable. But as he stepped into the room, his eyes meeting mine, something unspoken passed between us. A flicker of awareness that neither of us could ignore. After that afternoon with the dress, I told myself it was nothing. A fleeting moment of awkwardness, a misstep in my otherwise controlled life. Caleb had helped me, nothing more. But the memory lingered, not just in my mind but in the way I carried myself around him. I became hyper-aware of his presence, the sound of his footsteps, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, the way his attention felt heavier than it should have. At first, I chalked it up to my overactive imagination, a byproduct of too much time spent alone. But then there were the little things. He started coming downstairs more often when James wasn't home, finding excuses to linger in the kitchen while I cooked or to sit in the living room while I read. His gaze lingered just a fraction too long, his smile holding a subtle warmth that made my pulse quicken. One evening, as I prepared dinner, I caught him watching me through the kitchen doorway. His face was unreadable, his expression calm, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled me. When I turned to ask him if he needed anything, he simply shook his head and disappeared back upstairs, leaving me with a knot in my stomach I couldn't explain. At the same time, I noticed changes in myself. I began putting more thought into how I looked, choosing outfits that made me feel confident rather than comfortable. I lingered over small details like my hair or perfume, catching myself wondering if Caleb would notice. I told myself it was harmless, that I just wanted to feel good about myself again. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. James remained oblivious, his focus entirely on work. His late nights at the office had become routine, and even when he was home, he was emotionally absent. Conversations were brief, perfunctory exchanges about bills or schedules. I couldn't remember the last time he had looked at me the way Caleb did, as though I were more than just a fixture in the house, but someone worth noticing. The tension between Caleb and me grew in silence, filling the spaces between us. There were moments when I caught him looking at me and quickly looking away, his face betraying nothing but his actions speaking volumes. I found myself replaying those moments in my head, analyzing every glance, every word, as though trying to uncover a hidden meaning. Then came the night that shifted everything further. I had settled on the couch with a glass of wine, the weight of the day pressing down on me. Caleb wandered into the living room, casual and unassuming in a t-shirt and sweatpants. He gave me a small smile before asking if he could join me. I hesitated but nodded, telling myself there was no harm in it. As we sat there, the air felt different, charged in a way I couldn't ignore. The conversation was light at first, but then it turned deeper. He commented on how nice it was to be home, how much he had missed these moments of quiet. I felt his words settle over me like a blanket, warm but suffocating in their honesty. And then he said it, his voice soft but deliberate. "You don't deserve to feel alone." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I looked at him, searching for something in his expression that might make it easier to dismiss. But his gaze was steady, unwavering, and I felt something stir within me, an ache I had buried for far too long. From that night forward, the boundary between us seemed thinner, more fragile. Every interaction felt like a step closer to something neither of us dared to name. I told myself I was imagining it, but the truth was impossible to ignore. The line was there, but we were both standing too close to it, daring it to disappear. The days that followed were marked by a current of tension so palpable it felt like a living, breathing thing. Caleb and I moved through the house as though on the edge of something dangerous, both of us acutely aware of the other's presence but unwilling, or unable, to address it. Every glance, every accidental touch, seemed to magnify the unspoken connection between us. It wasn't just what was said, it was the silence that spoke louder, charged with possibility. One evening, the storm outside mirrored the one brewing within me. Thunder rumbled low and ominous as rain streaked the windows, painting the house in a dim, golden glow. I had poured myself a glass of wine, hoping it might calm the restless energy surging through me. James was gone again, his absence both a relief and a burden. The loneliness I had grown so used to now felt unbearable in the wake of Caleb's presence. I heard his footsteps descending the stairs, soft and deliberate. My heart raced before I even saw him. When he entered the room, his casual appearance, a plain t-shirt and pajama pants, did nothing to diminish the intensity he carried with him. He hesitated in the doorway, his eyes meeting mine with a question he didn't dare voice. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rapid beating of my heart. "Something like that," he replied, stepping further into the room. He gestured to the couch. "Mind if I join you?" I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. He settled into the cushions across from me, his posture relaxed but his gaze anything but. The room suddenly felt smaller, the space between us charged with an unspoken understanding. The sound of rain filled the silence as we sat there, both of us pretending not to notice the tension crackling in the air. "It's been nice having you here," I said finally, my voice soft. "It feels different." "Different how?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. I hesitated, searching for the right words. It's good to have someone around. To not feel so alone." He didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "You shouldn't have to feel alone. Not ever." The weight of his words settled over me, heavy and undeniable. I looked away, but I could feel his gaze on me, unwavering. When I finally met his eyes again, there was something there I couldn't ignore, something that made my breath catch and my pulse quicken. It wasn't just the way he looked at me. It was the way he saw me, truly and completely, in a way I hadn't been seen in years. "You deserve more than this," he said softly, his words both a comfort and a challenge. "You deserve to feel wanted, to feel alive." My throat tightened, and I swallowed hard, unable to respond. The truth in his words was too painful, too raw to confront. But as much as I wanted to deny it, I couldn't. Not when every moment we spent together seemed to pull me closer to the edge of something I couldn't name. The days blurred together, each one bringing us closer to a line I knew we couldn't cross. Yet, despite my better judgment, I found myself drawn to him in ways I couldn't explain. I sought out his presence, lingering in the kitchen when I knew he'd passed through, or finding reasons to spend time in the same room. It was a dangerous game, but I couldn't stop myself from playing it. Then came the night that everything changed. The house was quiet, James away on another late-night meeting. I was standing by the window, the cool glass against my fingertips grounding me as I stared out into the stormy darkness. I didn't hear Caleb enter the room, but I felt his presence before I saw him. When I turned, he was there, his silhouette framed by the soft light of the hallway. "You're still awake," he said, his voice low. "So are you," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. The air between us felt impossibly thick, charged with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. Whatever this is, it's been building for a long time, hasn't it?" I didn't know how to respond. The honesty in his words was disarming, leaving me vulnerable in a way I wasn't prepared for. I turned away, my fingers gripping the edge of the windowsill as though it might anchor me. But when I felt his hand on my arm, gentle but firm, I couldn't ignore the pull any longer. "Tell me I'm wrong," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "Tell me you don't feel it too." I wanted to say the words, to push him away, and end whatever this was before it could go any further. But when I looked into his eyes, I knew I couldn't lie, not to him and not to myself. The truth was there, undeniable and inescapable, and it terrified me. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks finally reached its boiling point on a night that seemed destined to unravel everything. The house was quiet, as it often was when James worked late. But the silence felt heavier than usual, the kind that presses against your skin and makes every breath feel like a struggle. I was in the living room, a book open in my lap that I hadn't turned a page of in over an hour. My thoughts were elsewhere, on Caleb, on the unspoken words that had filled the space between us, and on the line we were both dangerously close to crossing. When I heard his footsteps on the stairs, my pulse quickened. I didn't look up right away, hoping to compose myself before he entered the room. But when I finally glanced up, he was already standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He hesitated, as though debating whether or not to step inside, and then made his way to the couch, sitting down across from me. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence between us was thick, charged with the weight of everything we weren't saying. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was the kind of silence that demanded acknowledgement, that refused to be ignored. Finally, Caleb broke the stillness. "Karen," he said softly, his voice steady but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "We need to talk." My breath caught, and I set the book aside, my hands trembling slightly. "About what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on me. "About us," he said simply, the words landing like a stone in the stillness of the room. "There is no us, Caleb," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "This is just, it's nothing. It's in your head." "Is it?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Because it doesn't feel like nothing to me. And I don't think it feels like nothing to you either." I opened my mouth to protest, to deny the truth in his words, but I couldn't. The intensity in his gaze, the raw honesty in his voice, it left me exposed, vulnerable in a way I wasn't prepared for. I looked away, my hands twisting in my lap as I tried to find the right words, but none came. "I know you feel it," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Every time we're in the same room, every time I look at you, I see it. I feel it. And I know you do too." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "This is wrong, Caleb. You know that. We can't do this." "I know it's not simple," he said, his voice steady. "But that doesn't make it any less real." He stood then, crossing the small space between us in a few deliberate steps. When he crouched down in front of me, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the couch, I felt my resolve begin to crumble. His presence was overwhelming, his gaze intense and unrelenting. "Tell me you don't feel anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me and I'll walk away." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. The words were on the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't bring myself to say them. Because as much as I wanted to deny it, as much as I wanted to push him away, I couldn't lie, not to him, and not to myself. Instead, I leaned back, breaking the connection between us. "You should go," I said, my voice trembling. This can't happen." He didn't move right away. For a moment, I thought he might ignore my words, that he might stay and force me to confront the feelings I was desperately trying to suppress. But then he nodded, his expression unreadable as he rose to his feet. "Good night, Karen," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of finality that made my chest ache. "Good night," I replied, barely above a whisper. I watched him leave, his footsteps fading into the silence of the house. When he was gone, I let out a shaky breath, my hands gripping the edge of the couch as though it might anchor me. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, leaving me reeling. I had told him to go, had drawn the line I knew we couldn't cross, but the truth was I didn't feel relief. I felt loss. For the rest of the night, I replayed the moment in my mind, the look in his eyes, the raw vulnerability in his voice. I told myself I had done the right thing, that I had stopped something before it went too far. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The line between us was still there, but it was thinner now, more fragile. And I wasn't sure how much longer it could hold. The next day, everything came crashing down. It was a Saturday, and James had decided to spend the morning at home for the first time in weeks. I was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, when I heard Caleb and James talking in the living room. Their voices were low, casual, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe that everything was normal. But then I heard James's tone shift, his voice sharp and questioning. I couldn't make out the words, but the tension was unmistakable. I stepped closer to the doorway, my heart racing as I tried to decipher their conversation. When I finally caught Caleb's response, my blood ran cold. I just think she deserves more, Caleb said, his voice steady but firm. More? James repeated, his tone incredulous. What the hell does that mean? There was a pause, and then Caleb's voice, quieter now but no less certain. It means you don't see her, not the way she deserves to be seen. My breath caught, and I pressed a hand to my chest, the weight of his words hitting me like a blow. The silence that followed was deafening, and I knew I couldn't stay hidden any longer. I stepped into the living room, my eyes darting between the two of them. What's going on? I asked, my voice trembling. Both men turned to look at me, their expressions starkly different. James's face was a mask of confusion and suspicion, while Caleb's held a quiet resolve that sent a shiver down my spine. Nothing, James said quickly, his tone dismissive. Just a misunderstanding. But Caleb didn't look away. He held my gaze, his expression unyielding, and I knew in that moment that everything had changed. The unspoken tension between us was no longer a secret, no longer something we could pretend didn't exist. The revelation, or perhaps the moment of confrontation, left a ripple that couldn't be undone. The air in the house felt heavier, like a suffocating presence that seeped into every corner. James's suspicion had been sparked, and while Caleb remained calm, his words hung in the space between us like a storm cloud waiting to break. James didn't press further that day, but his demeanor shifted. He watched me more closely, his usually distracted gaze now sharp and calculating. Conversations became clipped and tense, and every time Caleb entered the room, I could feel James's eyes darting between us, searching for something he couldn't quite name but undoubtedly felt. I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, throwing myself into daily tasks and pretending that everything was fine. But the truth was I was unraveling. The weight of what had passed between Caleb and me, coupled with James's newfound vigilance, was too much to bear. My hands trembled as I folded laundry, my heart raced whenever I caught Caleb's eye, and my mind replayed that moment in the living room over and over again. Caleb, on the other hand, seemed unbothered. He carried on as though nothing had changed, his presence calm and steady. But it was in the quiet moments, the ones when James wasn't watching, that his true feelings surfaced. A lingering glance, a brush of his hand against mine as we passed in the hallway, a soft smile that spoke volumes. Each interaction was a reminder of the line we had danced dangerously close to crossing. It all came to a head one evening when James confronted me in the kitchen. He had been unusually quiet during dinner, his fork clinking against his plate, the only sound in the room. When Caleb excused himself and went upstairs, James turned to me, his expression cold and accusing. "What's going on between you two?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my attempt at feigned ignorance. "Don't play dumb, Karen," he snapped, his tone rising. "I see the way he looks at you. The way you look at him." Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm. "You're imagining things," I said, shaking my head. "Caleb is your son, for God's sake. This is ridiculous." "Is it?" he asked, stepping closer. "Because I don't think it is. I think there's something you're not telling me." The tension between us was unbearable, the silence stretching as I struggled to find the right words. Finally, I said, "Nothing is happening, James. You're being paranoid." But the seed had been planted, and I knew it wouldn't go away. James's suspicion had been aroused, and no amount of denial would erase it. The dynamic in the house shifted further after that conversation. James became more distant, his absence now laced with resentment. Caleb and I avoided being alone in the same room for too long, our interactions careful and measured. Despite my efforts to keep things under control, the weight of it all became too much. One night, after James had gone to bed, I found Caleb in the living room. He was sitting on the couch, a book in his hands, but his eyes lifted to mine the moment I entered the room. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice breaking. He set the book aside and stood, his expression soft but serious. "What do you mean? This us? Whatever this is. It has to stop," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I can't keep living like this, Caleb. It's destroying me." He stepped closer, his gaze full of concern. "Karen, I don't want to hurt you. That's the last thing I want." "Then let me go," I whispered. "Please." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might argue. But then he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "If that's what you want." "It's not about what I want," I said, my voice trembling. "It's about what's right." We stood there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. Finally, I turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the living room. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I had made the right choice. The ache in my chest told me I hadn't, but my conscience told me I had no other option. The days that followed were a blur of emotional turmoil. Caleb began spending more time out of the house, and James's distance became more pronounced. The once comfortable rhythm of our lives had been shattered, replaced by a fragile, fractured existence that none of us knew how to navigate. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Caleb's words, his touch, the way he had looked at me, they lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of the connection we had shared. I knew I had made the right choice, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a loss, one that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The house, once filled with a quiet rhythm of familiarity, now felt like a hollow shell of what it used to be. James's presence was even more scarce, and when he was home, he kept to himself, his focus lost in his work or his phone. Caleb, on the other hand, had all but vanished from the shared spaces, retreating to his room or leaving the house entirely. The energy between us three had fractured beyond repair, leaving only silence and the ghosts of what once was. I tried to find solace in routine, throwing myself into tasks that might distract me. But no amount of cleaning, organizing, or pretending could erase the memories that haunted me. The look in Caleb's eyes that night, the unspoken understanding we had shared, the connection that had both terrified and exhilarated me. It all lingered, refusing to fade. I kept telling myself I had made the right decision. I had stopped something that would have destroyed everything, something that could never have been right, no matter how real it had felt in the moment. But the ache in my chest didn't subside. The loss wasn't just of Caleb's presence. It was of a part of myself I had rediscovered in his gaze. For the first time in years, I had felt seen, alive, and wanted. Letting go of that was like burying a piece of my soul. James never brought up his suspicions again, but his withdrawal spoke louder than words. Our marriage had always been built on a fragile foundation of routine and expectation, but now even that had crumbled. The connection we had once shared felt irretrievably lost, leaving us as two strangers occupying the same space. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, Caleb came downstairs. It was the first time we had been alone in days. He hesitated in the doorway, his expression careful but filled with a quiet longing. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said, his voice steady. I turned to face him, my heart sinking. "So soon?" He nodded, stepping closer. "I think it's for the best." The weight of his words pressed down on me, but I knew he was right. As much as it hurt, his leaving was the only way we could both begin to move forward. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said softly, my voice breaking. His eyes held mine, and for a moment the unspoken connection between us felt almost unbearable. "You too," he said finally. The next morning he was gone. I watched from the window as he loaded his bags into his car and drove away without looking back. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was a silence I knew I had to face. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rebuild myself, piece by piece. I started going for long walks, reconnecting with old friends, and finding small joys in the things I had once loved. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of everything threatened to crush me, but I kept moving forward, one step at a time. Looking back now, I see the experience as both a warning and a lesson. It taught me the dangers of neglecting myself, of letting loneliness and resentment fester until they threatened to destroy everything I held dear. It also reminded me of the power of connection, of how deeply we all crave to be seen and understood. If I've learned anything, it's that we must confront the cracks in our lives before they grow too wide to mend. The temptation to seek fulfillment elsewhere can be powerful, but it's a fleeting escape that leaves more destruction in its wake than resolution. True healing comes from within, from facing the pain, addressing the emptiness, and finding ways to rebuild. Though I'll carry the scars of this chapter with me forever, they serve as a reminder of what's truly important: honesty, boundaries, and the courage to face the truths we'd rather avoid. And while I'll always wonder what might have been, I know that the choices I made were the right ones, for myself, for my family, and for the future I'm still learning to embrace. If you were in her shoes, what would you have done? Could you have walked away, or would the temptation have been too strong? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories that delve into the complexities of love, betrayal, and the choices that define us. Stay tuned. Our next story will leave you speechless.